Did you know that people think there's only one way of putting binding on? They are threatened by the mitered corners and they think it involves a lot of hand sewing. There are actually several ways of putting binding on. So finishing the binding is important. You have to have something to enclose the edges of your quilt. And a nice banding just really finishes off the edge. So the first thing I have to do is trim this quilt. So I'm going to take it to my big table and I'm going to just cut all this off so I have a straight edge to work with. First of all, I'm going to show you how to actually put the binding together because it's a very long strip of fabric and you need to join it with a diagonal seam. And it's a really easy thing to do. If you already know how to do this, just skip over it and move on to the next step. So here I've cut 4 long strips of fabric in the fabric I'm going to use. 3 of them have to have a diagonal mark put on them. There's 2 ways to do this. Either you can put it on a cutting board that's got a diagonal line across it. What you would do is lay your ruler diagonally across them and just use a pen and draw your line. The other way to do this is to get your ironing board, fold over the corner so it's exactly a diagonal triangle there, can you see that? And iron that down. And that also will give you the diagonal mark on your fabric. So the next thing you're going to do is machine these into place. So this first piece, I'm putting it this way down, right sides up. This one here already has my diagonal marked on it, and I'm going to lay that at right angles. You want these to exactly match so that you've got a good join. And then if you want to, you can put a pin to just hold that in place. And then we'll take that to the sewing machine and sew down them all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin all of them together and just chain sew. I always start off on something like this by just running a little bumper stopper. People call them different things. It's just a little piece of fabric. And you want to just stick to your diagonal line and go corner to corner. Following the line that I've drawn on my fabric. So the next piece, again, you're going to lay so that the side is facing up and it's horizontally across like that. And you're just going to follow the same thing, lay it at a right angle, match these up. And just sew corner to corner along your line. This is 4 strips, but it's only 3 seams. Now when I cut these apart, I'll have a long strip of fabric. And what I'm going to do then is just open these up. I'm going to press these seams open. It's just easier to press these open if you leave the corners on for the moment. Once I've pressed them like that, then I'm going to cut this triangle of fabric off. And then when you open it all out, you've got a long strip of fabric ready to use. So when you've done all of that, you've got a very long strip, and this is what your seams look like. They look like a diagonal on the back and on the front. They really don't show that much depending on what fabric you use. And it's important to do this rather than just do a seam that goes like that, because this is going to be folded double and then folded over the quilt, and you'd just have a really bulky piece here if you didn't do the diagonal seam. So once you've got your really long strip made, you're going to fold and iron this in half. Now you want to try and match these edges up exactly. You want this to be all nice and even all the way along. And just press it along as you go. And you're just going to repeat that all the way until you've got a long strip of doubled fabric, which is long enough to go all the way around your quilt and some extra. So how much binding you need varies quilt to quilt, of course. To get the amount that you need, you measure all the way around the outside. So if your quilt is 54 inches along each side, then you want 4 times 54. Then you need to add about 2.5 inches for each corner and about 2.5 inches for each join, and then a couple of inches extra for the end where you've got to maneuver a little bit and join the binding. So, you know, it's never an exact measurement. Once you know the total amount approximately of what you need, divide that by about 40. Fabric is usually about 41 inches wide. So that'll tell you how many strips you need. This binding demonstration is going to be the hand finished way of doing it. This is the binding strip that I've made. I've kind of put it in a loop. I just usually do this and just sit it on my knee and don't really have a problem with it. At my machine, before I start sewing, I need to have a couple of things ready. I need some scissors, a ruler. I like this little special ruler, but just a regular ruler will be okay if that's what you need to use, and a little marking pen. Because I'm hand finishing this quilt, the hand finishing part will be on the back. So I'm going to sew my binding onto the front of the quilt. I always start, I sew about 8 or 10 inches from the corner. I have my binding here, and this may unravel while I'm quilting and fall on the floor. Sometimes it does, but it really doesn't make any difference. You're also going to leave a little tail at the end so that you've got some maneuvering when you join. The binding goes with these raw edges. Remember, it's double, and they go to the raw edges of the quilt. Now, I don't usually pin this in place. If you prefer to pin it in place before you start, that's fine. I usually just lay mine on there and sew as I go. I do a little bit larger stitch than normal on my sewing machine because this is sewing through several layers. On some machines, you may need a walking foot to do this. If you don't use a walking foot when you're sewing through layers like this, it will stretch the top layer and the bottom layer at a different rate. And when you get to the end, you may have this much fabric difference, and you don't want that. So I would suggest that you do a test strip on your sewing machine and see whether you need a walking foot. This machine does not need one because it has a pressure release knob up here, and so I've got that turned up to the slightest pressure. Now I'm going to start sewing here, and I'm doing a generous 1/4 inch. I'm just going to start sewing. This is just a straight sew until you get almost to the bottom corner. I'm almost at my corner now, and what I want to do here is mark a 1/4 inch. On this ruler, I can actually set this is why I like it, to where that little red marks the 1/4 inch for me. And so that won't move now, and I won't have to measure it each time. The orange line doesn't show up, so I've just got my little Chaco marker out. I'm going to mark it with that. This is a line that doesn't need to stay on here for very long. So I'm marking 1/4 inch from the end. And I'm already on a 1/4 inch at this point. So I'm going to sew up to that line that I've just marked. I'm going to try and be really precise about it. Okay, now I'm going to stop my machine, and here I'm just going to turn it at an angle, and I'm going to sew out to the corner, and then I'm finishing it off. Let me hold this closer in case you didn't see that. This is navy blue. It doesn't show very well. I suppose, you know, I could have used a bright colour. I've seen people do that on shows, but this is something real that I'm actually making, so I don't want to sew it in bright red that's going to show at the end. But there, I have just machined to the corner and cut it off. So this next bit is how you make the mitered corner, and this is actually really easy. At the moment it hangs straight down to the bottom, but what you're going to do is you're going to turn it, and now you have a little start with that corner, and fold it back like that. So now your binding is in a straight line along here. You see that okay? You can just put a pin in there temporarily if you want to hold that. I usually don't. I usually just fold it back and hold it with my fingers. Now you're going to fold it back along the line that you're going to sew along. And this corner you're just going to line up there, and that's good. And again, if you want to, you can just put a pin there to hold it in place till you start sewing. So now I'm ready to start sewing on my second edge. In my little bumper stop for this one because I'm starting at the edge. And again, that good 1/4 of an inch. This part is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to join the two edges of the binding together. So I've taken it off the sewing machine for now, and this corner I'm just going to treat exactly the same as I did all the others. Fold it in place with the mitered corner ready. And then I'm actually going to pin this to secure it because I want to make sure this stays exactly where I want it. So over here you can see I've got extra pieces and you really need these to work with. What you're aiming to do is put a join somewhere here in the center so that you've got a little bit of space for this fabric to move on each side. So if I want my join to be about there, I want to cut this particular piece fabric off somewhere around here as to where I think I want the edge to be. Don't feel that this is a slanted seam that you're doing. So I'm going to cut it about there. Now this one that's coming down from the other side needs to cross over by 2 1/4 inches, just the same way that you did your joins when you were making the binding. They were all 2 1/4 inches. So I'm going to measure 2 1/4 inches here. I can just see the underneath 1/4 of an inch mark. And so I'm going to make a mark there. And then I'm going to cut that off at that mark. Okay, you see that overlap? Now the next thing you're going to do is fold this. And what you want is to fold it down so you've got that 45-degree angle. So just match the sides up exactly, make the corner right. When you've got it in place, for this you're just going to finger press it. And do a pretty good finger press. just have to move your fabric a little bit and things so that you can do it working in this small space. And open it up and look. Now, if you think you're going to be able to see that line to sew it on your machine, that's fine. If you don't think you are, then with a pen, just mark that line while you know that you can see it easily. I'm just going to put I think I'll be able to see it, but I'm just going to put a mark to make sure I can see the top and the bottom. Now, fold it back into position and lay it in place. So in the end, that's what it'll look like. So under here, you can open you've got a centerpiece here, which is this piece. You can open that up, and your two pieces here are already aligned the way that you want them to be. So just pick it up like that, keeping those edges. And can you see that you've actually got your fabric at a right angle the way you want it? So you just want to make sure this all lines up properly. Put a pin in there. It's just a little bit awkward because you're working in such a small space. And then another pin in there. Now you're going to put this back under your machine and sew along the diagonal. The easiest way to do this is to just fold those two pieces of fabric together. Now you've got a little area to work and just sew along that line. You're not sewing along your pins, you're sewing along the line that you've folded or marked. So I've sewed along that diagonal and trimmed it off. Actually, before I trimmed it, I did just fold it in place and make sure that it would be a good fit. Once you've trimmed it off, it's difficult to fix it. So I did double check and it was a good fit. So I finger pressed those open, folded it over, and now I'm just going to sew that edge down. My pin here is holding my corner in place, and for this I am actually just going to put a couple of pins in here, with it being the last bit, to make sure that I don't end up with a wrinkle at the end. This is where I started on the sewing when I did the very first beginning. I'm just going to join to that line of stitching. So that's all done. So the next thing that you're going to do is press your binding outwards, and then you're going to fold it over at the back. So I usually start with the corners. I fold it back like that and pin it. So you can see that gives you a nice mitre at the back and at the front. Hope that shows up on camera. And then you're going to go all the way along. It'll be easier if you've pressed it. I haven't pressed this out yet. And pin it over. Your aim is you have a sewing line on this side. And again, you might not be able to see this. This thread is such a good match. It's kind of hidden on the navy. But you'll see it when you're doing it. And you're going to line up slightly over that stitching. This fold should be full of fabric. There shouldn't be any at the end here that's just feels empty inside. So we'll go along there and pin it in place, and then we'll start and do some hand sewing on this. Once you've pinned all the way around your sides of your quilt, and you do want to make sure that when you look at the front, this is an even distance. And some other things that you can use as well as an alternative to pins are these little clips. Some people like to use these and just clip them on, and they work just as well, and you don't get stuck with your pins either. So whichever one you prefer, just put those away. And then I have my needle here. I have my thimble on because I like to sew with the thimble. I usually use a single strand, and I don't usually get my cotton too long because it just knots. And you may prefer to sew with a double thread, but knotting is another reason that I don't usually sew with a double thread. And I've always found a single thread is okay. And so you're going to do a stitch that's quite invisible, and you're going to use the stitching line that your machine did on the back side of this as your guide to keep you straight. So I'm going to just lift that up so that my knot is under there. So I'm going to go slightly in front of and through the machine stitch, and then come out in that fold. When I put my stitch back in, it's going to be directly below where the stitch came out. My stitch movement is all going to be underneath the fabric to the next point here. And you want to be careful when you do this as well, that you don't take too big a bite so that your stitch goes through to the front. You want this to be invisible on the right side of the fabric. So this is a pretty simple stitch. It just goes in and out, and you're just going to repeat that all the way along. And you know, this is time consuming, but it's the kind of thing that you can do sitting in front of the TV. I like to hand stitch, so it doesn't bother me to do this. I don't hand stitch many quilts anymore. I usually, if they're for family or for some special reason, I've got a thread there I need to cut off, then I will do it this way. Otherwise, I usually machine quilt them. So that's the basic stitch. I'm going to go on all the way around. If this video has been helpful, please subscribe, and I'm going to show some more ways of doing bindings.